They came in the night, and by dawn the island belonged to someone else. Aelfwyn felt the heat before she saw the flames, a bitter, oily warmth that moved along the low vaults and crept under the rafters. The beeswax in the chapel had not yet burned away. Its sweet smoke still wreathed the pillars, mingling with the acid tang of charred wood. Her rosary beads were slick beneath her fingers. Outside, men shouted in a language that wore iron on its tongue. Somewhere, a bell had been dragged to the shore and struck until its tongue was silent. What Vikings did to the nuns of Lindisfarne was worse than death, not because they killed bodies, though many were killed, but because they set themselves to take away what made life holy and private and human, the names the women called themselves, the vows they had spoken in the dim hours, the small reliquaries pressed next to a sleeping cheek. The violence that began at the altar did not stop at blood and flame. It continued in long, quiet procedures designed to unravel identity. This is the story of one of those women, and of the way a community's life could be disassembled, piece by piece. Lindisfarne, around the late 8th century, was an island of salt and prayer. Built upon tides and blessed by the relics it sheltered, the priory answered to a rhythm of incense and labor, the bell before dawn, the scraping of quills over parchment, the slow, deliberate folding of wool. Monks and nuns lived within stone walls that kept out weather, and until that night, most human menace. The island sat where trade routes ran thin, and where a long ship could creep in under cover of fog. It was valuable in 3 ways: in the metal stored in chests and shrines, in the symbolic power of its relics and prayer, and in the easy access afforded by its shoreline. Contemporary annals do not give us the private hours. They record the event in formal, spare sentences. In this year, dreadful signs were seen in the land. Fierce raiders came and ravaged holy places. Such entries tell us a raid occurred. They do not tell us what it felt like to have the beads slipped from your fingers as a stranger's hand closed over your wrist. For that, we must move closer to the ruined stones, to the hem of a habit, to the quiet work of remembering. If this account pauses on names and moments, it is because names matter. The woman who crouched by the altar that night had a name she had been given at baptism, and when her name was taken from her, it was also a taking of a history. Call her Aelfwyn. She was not famous in any chronicle. The records are silent about many individuals. We know only that she had entered the priory as a novice in her youth, that she was careful with small things, charcoal for the ink, thread for the vestments, and that she had a habit of tucking tiny tokens into the hems of cloth. After the first shock, smoke, screams, the sound of a bell knocked from its hinge, came the sorting. Raiders moved with an economy of cruelty. Men with spears made choices without speech. Those who might be ransomed were kept together. Those too broken or too old were left to the elements. Those likely to fetch a price or be useful as household labor were marked and carried away. Contemporary descriptions of Norse raiding strategies indicate a purpose more complex than mere plunder. Captives, especially young women, were a kind of portable wealth: bargains, brides, servants, trophies. A short chronicle fragment, written in a monk's cramped hand and preserved later in a damaged folio, reads as if spoken through a mouth still raw from grief. They laid hands on the sisters, and some were burned with the books. Some were taken to the ships. The bells were quenched, and the relics made spoil. Great terror there was. The rhythm of the sentence offers both fact and a blank where memory should be. It does not tell us how the women measured grief by the weight of a bead, what they felt when a habit was struck off and a new cloth given in return. Phase 1. Shock and separation. The first thing they did was to unmake community. Aelfwyn remembers the clatter, iron against stone, a man's boot upon the step. A warrior seized her elbow. Another wrenched away the kerchief from her hair. They did not speak of piety as they removed the outward signs of it. They were pragmatic. The habit made a woman visible in a particular way, and cloth could be turned into a commodity or a disguise. The removal of habit was not merely clothing, it was the first act of erasure. They took the systems apart into groups, men with simple lists, and oral tally, hands pointing, sorted captives for different ends. Some would be led to the ships, manacled and placed beneath a makeshift awning. Some would be held for ransom, a bargaining chip to be exchanged for silver or to settle feuds. Some would be kept and folded into Norse households as thralls. Exactly how organized these choices were is indefinito. It varied with the leaders and the needs of the raid. But the pattern, practical, economical, and relentless, reappears in accounts of other coastal assaults. In the harsh light of morning, when Aelfwyn's head swam and the island smelled like smoke and salt, she felt a hand at her back. They marched, not at first as prisoners, but as plunder, whose value had yet to be decided. Men walked with their spoils, drums of stolen honey, chests of melted silver, the blackened remains of books. The abbess, older and with a face like a map of all the winters she had seen, was dragged and pushed, but held her chin high. Her dignity the raiders treated as another item to remove. They cut the cords of office and turned embroidered sleeves into bundles. We must be careful here. The image of a singular, efficient system of processing captives, like a medieval factory, comes from later readings, and in some cases from analogous operations in different cultures.
Viking raids were opportunistic and adaptive rather than bureaucratic in the modern sense. Still, there was method, choices based on age, perceived health, skills, and appearance. A woman who had learned to mend cloth or read Latin might be considered useful in a hall where the lord valued embroidery and ritual. A girl might be chosen for her youth alone. The cruelty of such decisions lay in their calmness, as if one were evaluating the condition of a horse. Phase 2, enforced acculturation. The first weeks were a slow erosion under the guise of making life workable. Aelfwyn found herself in a longhouse where the light shivered through oiled skins and where the smell of salted meat replaced incense. At first, she clung to the Latin psalms as if they were a rope. She whispered them under her breath as she worked, stitching by the glow of oil lamps. But their language pressed against hers like a sea swell. Men and women she had never seen ordered her in speech she could not answer without stumbling. Simple things were renaming rituals, becoming thrall in one tongue and given a different handle in another. Whether she was forced to adopt a Norse name at that first stage or later is indefinite. Sources vary. What is clear from broader evidence of contact between Norse settlers and Anglo-Saxon communities is that names could be adapted as a first step toward integration. A short entry in a later monastic ledger, itself a copy of a damaged original, lists losses and returns. Many women were taken, some were returned at ransom, others were kept as thralls, their tongues altered, their garb replaced. The ledger reads like an inventory. The clerical voice is dull with practical sorrow. The loss is recorded in columns, and yet between the lines one reads a different ledger, the ledger of what people felt and what they whispered when safe. Language here matters not merely as speech, but as habit. To call someone by another name is to cut a branch from the tree of memory. In the hall, Aelfwyn learned to answer when a stranger called her Aelfred, a name she did not own, but which, when repeated, began to settle heavy and wrong in her mouth. The daily tasks were both mundane and pedagogical. Learn the loom, string the beads in a different order, recite the Norse genealogies that the mistress favored around the hearth. That the captors wanted labor does not negate a deeper intent, molding a person's habits until the old ones become ragged and disused. Resistance took small forms. Aelfwyn sewed a tiny silver cross into the inner seam of a pouch and tied it to a button. She hid a scrap of vellum with a single Latin line in the false bottom of a basket. She folded her prayer into the quiet places, on the boat's timbers, in the space behind a hearthstone. One cannot always measure such acts in archaeological terms, but when tiny items survive in the earth, they speak like witnesses. Archaeological records from later excavations on the island and its environs indicate fragments consistent with these kinds of hidden resistances. Textile fragments, small copper alloy crosses, and beads, some pierced in a manner consistent with pendants, have been recovered from middens and graves near the shoreline. An archaeologist who has worked on these finds notes, the material evidence suggests continuities of devotional practice among some captives or settlers, even after violent dislocation. Objects are difficult to interpret conclusively. They do not tell a full story. But the persistence of certain motifs, crosses hidden in seams, for instance, suggests that private acts of faith continued despite external pressures. The scholar's tone is careful. Archaeology offers hints, not certainties. We must return to the women themselves as living beings. Among the captives, individuals reacted differently. There was Winflade, a novice who had been given to the care of a raider's household. She adapted outwardly more quickly than Aelfwyn, teaching herself to braid hair in a way the mistress liked, and to name the lord's lineage at mealtime. Her outward transformation shielded her from the worst hunger. Then there was Rofilda, fierce and obstinate, who tried to run and was flogged until she bore the marks of restraint. Some died in the making, some survived by the sharp calculus of compromise. Phase 3, the coerced relabeling of spiritual identity, did not always mean a formal conversion. It often took the shape of a public removal of symbols and the pressure to participate in household rituals alien to the captive's faith. If a woman's vows were private and inward, those vows could be made to seem irrelevant in the face of survival's arithmetic. The abbess's mantle became a curtain. The sister who had once led the daily prayers found herself lighting hearths and learning to chant a different name of praise. Records are sparse about documented conversions following raids. What we have are accounts suggesting that religion could be used instrumentally, abandoned in places where it impeded a new life, and clung to secretly where resistance remained possible. Aelfwyn's interior life began to split into compartments. In the dark of the longhouse, she repeated the psalm she had known by heart, until words turned brittle, as if paper left in rain. By day she learned to strack flax, to pull the spindle with a steady hand, and to nod when the mistress told a story of gods she did not know. Over time, the mouth obeyed the needs of the body. When a child was born to a local couple who had taken up residence on the island, Aelfwyn was tasked with helping to bathe and clothe the infant, an intimate work that had no place in the cloister, but that required skill she possessed. The irony was a constant ache. The hands that had once prepared linens for altars now prepared linens for a household's common use.
One evening, weeks into this new life, Aelfwyn was summoned to the hall. The chieftain, whose name the raider spoke as a key to status, sat on a low bench, his braids dark with oil. He watched her with a look measured as a knife. A woman named Gudrun moved among the captives, examining their eyes as if she were counting straw. Their fate would, in part, be decided by such inspections. Usefulness weighed against the effort required to keep a captive. "She is clever with threat," Gudrun said, in a language Aelfwyn only partly understood. "She will be of use." That sentence, simple and brutal, held the future in it. To be of use meant to be kept, but to be kept meant a life folded into someone else's household and law. For Aelfwyn, the thought of leaving Lindisfarne never returned in the same shape. The island she had loved was now inhabited by those who had taken it in the name of a different order. Her care for the altar was now a skill to be repurposed for a stranger's bedding. Between these lived the small resistances and the small collusions that constituted daily survival. Aelfwyn taught another captive, a girl named Eadberg, how to knot a particular stitch that would keep seams from fraying. She did it with care, because the task was beautiful and because it was work she knew. But the act had a different weight now. By teaching, she extended the value the captor saw in her. She was, in a way, instructing a new generation in the methods that kept the household running. The elder abbess watched through slitted eyes, as if measuring each stitch against an invisible ledger of sin and necessity. This is the pivot where the story grows darker in shape, not because worse acts of violence must be described, but because survival often presses a person into roles that repeat the violence in quieter, endless ways. The captors sometimes required those who had some standing, say someone who had been an abbess or a skilled needleworker, to instruct new captives in the skills that would make them useful. It is a history of co-optation. The survivor becomes, in practical terms, an agent of the system that destroyed them. Whether this was orchestrated as policy or emerged from ad hoc decisions is indefinito. Sources differ, and much is left to interpretation. But in many documented cases across eras of captivity, the same pattern recurs. Those with skills are pressed into training others, and thereby exchange a measure of survival for a fragment of agency that comes at a moral cost. Aelfwyn understood dyscalculus as if it were a room with the light dimmed. To teach was to prolong life. To refuse was to risk death. She had seen Eadberg's hands tremble when first shown the loom. Eadberg looked at her with a thingness that belonged more to hunger than to fear. In the longhouse, women learned by watching, by imitation, by the slow passing of a craft from one pair of hands to the next.
If Aelfwyn refused, Edberg might be left to a harsher fate. If she complied, she would be enacting the very system that had taken away the abbey's order. We must pause in this place, at the edge of a decision, to consider what is at stake: the loss not only of life, but of the shape of a life. A vow is a form of memory, a promise that organizes days. When a vow is reduced or stripped of its public signs, the vow's inner logic may survive in secret, or it may fray under pressure. Survival often demands a betrayal of the previous self. That betrayal is the center of the phrase, worse than death. Aelfwyn's body may remain, her name may be uttered in the Norse tongue, but the network of meaning that made her a sister in the priory, her place in liturgy, in discipline, in a community of mutual recognition, was under systematic dismantling. An archival insert. From a later monk's compilation, we find a terse inventory that might have been a list of ransom or losses. 1 abbess, many sisters, books and crosses, some returned, some carried away. We know not the fates of all. The voice is exhausted with the arithmetic of loss. It registers people as entries, an effect that seems faintly to imitate the economy that made them spoil. Aelfwyn kept the cross in a place where it nearly disappeared. It was a tiny object, bent and warm from fingers. At night she pressed it into her palm until her knuckles whitened, and then she would loosen the pressure so the shape of it would remain in her skin like a map. She whispered small psalms, not because she believed jargon could change her situation, but because sound itself was a shelter. The words made a private architecture around her head that no one could dismantle unless they searched the heart. Theirs was a faith of small acts now, the ordering of threads, the keeping of names in private, the folding of a relic into a stitched seam. But even private acts can become compromises. When Edberg, with eyes like a frightened sparrow, asked Aelfwyn how to sew without leaving traces of a cross, Aelfwyn hesitated. To teach secrecy was to acknowledge complicity in its perpetuation. To refuse was to risk Edberg's punishment. The ledger of moral responsibility grew heavy. There are moments when an event refracts into multiple timelines. In one, Aelfwyn refuses and is taken away. In another, she teaches and survives for years, her identity living in a clandestine seam that only she knows. We do not yet reach the point where history will tell which branch she took. The surviving documents, annals, later hagiographies, household lists, are at best fragments. Their silences are not neutral, they are the shape of power. And so the women moved forward, stitched into a world not their own, adapting and resisting in the spaces between duties. The island itself continued to be a place of comings and goings, ships arriving, men trading, children born to mixed households in years to come.
Some captives were ransomed back for silver and returned to places they scarcely recognized. Others remained, their names changed, their crafts altered, their faith worn thin but not wholly extinguished. The archaeology of Lindisfarne hints at these continuities: the cross pendants, the fragments of vestment with Christian motifs, the shallow graves that show signs of hurried but careful burial. Each object is an argument that not everything the raiders attempted to erase was erased entirely. Yet there is a deeper instrument at play than the mere taking of objects. It is the normalization of roles that undermines the inner life. A woman who is compelled to teach a new captive how to make a fine seam in exchange for bread participates with skill and steadiness in a system that eats at the memory of the abbey. She keeps alive knowledge once used for altar cloths, now turned to domestic use. This is the quiet cruelty, the repurposing of holiness into household utility, and the consequent hollowing out of meaning. A short fragment from a later scribe records a strange human image. Of one sister it is told that she taught the mistress's daughter the songs of the loom, and in the rhythm of the shuttle she hid her prayers. The scribe's words are pained and admiring. They show how acts of skill can be both survival and subtle resistance. We reach then the slow accumulation of years. The fire at the priory had been a beginning. The process that followed was an endurance test. For Aelfwyn, months passed in which she measured days by the tasks she completed: 3 baskets of yarn, a set of shirts patched, a small embroidered cross stitched into an infant's swaddling. She listened for news from the mainland, for rumors of ransoms, for the sound of a ship bearing a familiar face.
Such possibilities flickered and died like embers. Sometimes they rekindled into a hope that sustained her through a winter. But the island was changing underfoot. New names appeared in the earth. A Norse-style house might be raised where an outbuilding had once stood. The liturgical calendar she had kept now had to share space with feasts of a different sort. How much of this change was voluntary and how much coerced is indefinito. What appears in the archaeological record is a palimpsest of practices layered over one another. And then came an order that felt like a turning of the wheel. She was to instruct a group of newly taken women in the arts that made the captors wealthy: sewing, spinning, the making of cloth that would be used as trade goods or as household luxury. This instruction would mean taking her knowledge and transferring it into the hands of those who would perpetuate a life her old self had recognized as profane to its present uses. She understood, in a way that went straight through her ribs, that to teach was to help rebuild the economy that supported her captors. It was a moral crossroads. At the hall's threshold, Aelfwyn paused.
The window of the longhouse framed the sea like a slit. Far off, gulls argued with the wind. Her fingers, stiff with the loom, remembered every tiny technique her abbess had ever shown her. She pressed a thumb against the silver cross in her pocket until the metal grew warm. The cross knew the heat of her skin, and in that heat, something stubborn held. This is where the first part of our story settles, not at a conclusion, but on the edge of a choice that would define many lives. The forms of violence practiced at Lindisfarne did not always announce themselves with swords. Much of the harm was quieter and took place in the ordinary syllables of daily life. New names, new songs, a rewiring of labor, the slow folding of vows into secret pockets. The systematic destruction of identity is an act that can be as thorough as it is invisible. To remember it is to listen for the thin sounds it leaves behind, the rustle of cloth, the whisper of a prayer hidden in a stitch. If we are to understand what happened, we must hold both things at once: the outside events recorded in annals and inventories, and the private, tactile acts that archival paper does not carry. We must look at the shreds of cloth unearthed from middens, at the bent crosses recovered from graves, and we must also listen to the silence between entries, the parts the chroniclers did not see or chose not to record. After the teaching order came down, Aelfwyn took up her tools. She wrapped the silver cross in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into the hem of her working apron. The loom's shuttle slid back and forth. Eadberg hovered, palms cupped, waiting for instruction. Outside, in the channel, a ship's sail snapped like a great distant cloth. Inside, under the oil light, Aelfwyn threaded the needle and looked at the girl's eyes, a look that held hunger, fear, and a fragile hunger for learning. The first stitch she taught that evening would be precise and simple. It would also be the point at which survival began to require an act that intersected with betrayal. She raised the needle. The thread trembled, catching the light. In that single, ordinary motion, a future stretched out. One in which she might teach skill, and thereby live, and one in which she might refuse, and thereby die. The choice was not only hers, and not only simple. It was the place where the raid's violence became a long-term architecture of assimilation. An archived note, written in an uncertain hand generations later, remarks that many such women who remained were given household names and passed their knowledge forward. They live on in the craft of the place, though their names be little known. The note reads like a consolation and a sorrow. It acknowledges continuance and loss at once. The needle moved. The thread drew through time as surely as it drew through cloth. In the warm, small light, with the sea as a distant constant, Aelfwyn made the first stitch. The needles slipped through cloth and pulled with it the two lives that Aelfwyn now juggled, the woman who had knelt on cold stone, and the woman who counted warp by warp to keep from thinking of bone. The stitch was small and nearly invisible, a hem that would not show when a robe was folded and carried. Eadberg's good work bought bread, but also because a seam done sloppily would be noticed and punished. Skill was currency. Holiness had become a private coin. As the months went on, the household came to rely on her with a sort of grudging respect. The mistress, Gudrun, who had inspected the captives and pronounced judgments, began to call on Aelfwyn for finer work, the hemming of shirts for a visiting chieftain, the delicate repair of a child's swaddling that needed to impress allies. Aelfwyn's fingers remembered altar hems as easily as hearth linens. The skill did not know what kind of life would demand it. There was a new economy of labor now, fabrics mended for prestige, stitches that would be traded in markets, patterns that would mark a household's wealth. In the center of that economy sat women like Aelfwyn, whose craft quietly sustained a world that had taken theirs. The quiet, though, was full of edges. Eadberg's learning progressed beyond simple stitches. She began to ask the kinds of questions that unsettled Aelfwyn. Where is your family? Will you ever return? Do you still say the prayers? The questions were both innocent and dangerous, for they revealed the desire for story, for continuity. Aelfwyn answered in fragments, the way one answers when a whole truth might invite trouble. Sometimes I hear bells in my sleep, she said once, and Eadberg nodded as if she understood, though she could not have known the exact weight of bells on a midnight altar. Then came the day when the hall filled with news and men who smelled of iron and trade. New captives had come up the beach, women and children taken from a nearby settlement, faces full of fresh shock. They were younger than Aelfwyn had expected to see, some only girls, and they trembled like leaves in a draught. Gudrun called for Aelfwyn and ordered her to prepare a workbench in the great hall. Wordless desire and explicit command met there. The chieftain wanted to see that his new captives could be made useful, and Aelfwyn's skill made her the instrument for that making. It was a small scene of theater with terrible consequence. The captives were brought in and set on benches.
Their names, when known, were uttered in a mix of tongues and mispronunciations, new sounds shoehorned over old ones. The boys and men of the hall watched, partly for entertainment, partly to assess value. Gudrun stood like an officer conducting a muster. Aelfwyn understood the script before it was uttered. Demonstrate usefulness, show capacity for labor, teach the right tasks, and the captives might be spared worse fates. Her teaching would be the test. Teach them the needle, Gudrun said, voice even as a blade. Let them know what to do with linen. We will see who is fit. Aelfwyn stepped forward with a weight in her chest she could not name. In the face of the new captive's blankness, she felt something like pity. There was also a calculation. The family that once sang the hours might now be reduced to people who could stitch a shirt. She set up the bench and laid out bits of cloth, spools of thread. The chieftain, seated on his bench of carved wood, watched with a look that mixed approval and curiosity. She began, as she had with Eadberg, with the simplest running stitch, the one that taught how to keep a line steady. Her hands moved automatically. She spoke in small phrases of the motion, demonstrating how the thread must pass under the fabric, then over. The women watched like pupils at a hearth, their fingers fumbling to imitate the rhythm. For a moment, the hall was merely a place of learning, and the old shape of her life, teacher, sister, craftswoman, seemed to reappear under new and injurious light. But the lesson that Gudrun and the chieftain wanted was not only technical, it was symbolic. By showing how readily she could transform domestic skill into a means of sustaining the new order, Aelfwyn was asked to perform the legitimacy of the captor's economy. The demonstration validated the exchange, women as labor, skill as commodity, life as utility. The audience clapped in a manner that felt to Aelfwyn like the closing of a hand. Afterwards, while the men drank and counted goods, Gudrun pulled Aelfwyn aside. "You did well," she said. "You will teach more. The chieftain likes it when his household runs tidy. There is honor in making a household run so." The word honor slid in a direction Aelfwyn did not expect. It was not honor as she had known it in the priory, but honor as the approval of authority. Survival, once again, was wrapped in new names. And then the request was folded into command. News came that chieftains from the mainland would pass by on their way south. They sought cloaks and linens, and the chieftain of the island hoped to offer fine work as tribute. The women must be trained to produce such goods, he said. Aelfwyn's role expanded from mender to instructor. She was asked to create patterns, to speed the work, to train a small workforce.
This is the point the sad arithmetic tightened. To teach more was to ensure continued survival of those she taught. To refuse was to risk punishment for herself, and perhaps harsher fates for them. The choice was not between good and evil in tidy forms, but between layers of harm. Aelfwyn felt the cress of days like hands closing on a wound. Inside herself, compartments shifted further. There were nights when she held the cross until dawn and prayed with the desperation of someone naming each bead in turn. Then there were hours when she sharpened a needle and taught a dozen new fingers the wagon wheel stitch that made a garment hold. Each act of instruction was both mercy and betrayal. The pattern of the stitches became a kind of ledger she carried in her memory. One evening, as she worked alone by lamplight, Edberg slipped into the room with a bowl of broth. Her face had shaded, and an edge of something like resolve sat there. "They say a boat comes tomorrow," she said quietly. "A man from the mainland pays silver to get his daughter back." Edberg looked down into the broth, as if she could see there the shape of possibilities. Aelfwyn's throat tightened. The hope of ransom reached in like a possible hand to be grasped. Sometimes mercies came through coin, and it was a brightness that made the room seem dangerous. In the early dawn, while the sea hissed under a sky the color of old pewter, a sound of drums and voices rose. Not raiders this time, a different party, men clothed in trade, not in the rough smell of violent plunder. A small boat came and moored under the island's lee. A man stepped out, carrying an object wrapped in oilskin. He was guided to the chieftain. A council was held, and the talk of returns and exchange and the price of people took over the hall. The person who had arrived bore a name and a desire to reclaim a child. A ransom was discussed. In the shuffle that followed, names were spoken and lists were made. Aelfwyn listened as one of the newly brought girls, barely more than a child, was told her mother might come. Hope, sharp and immediate, moved among them like a new fire. Ransoms, in the world of coastal raids, could undo at least some of the damage. Families who could pay could sometimes purchase the return of a loved one. These returns were uneven and often partial. Some captives came back with new scars and new names. Some did not come back at all. A short chronicle fragment, written years later in the monk's hand and preserved among other notes, records the awkward economy of these trades. Some came back for silver. Some were taken to foreign halls. Many we name not, for the ledger is thin and our memory thinner. The entry is economy itself, human life rendered into exchange. When the child was returned, on a morning that smelled like sea salt and a tide turning, there was a tenderness in the hall that made even the chieftain's eyes narrow.
The mother ran to the girl, and the two clung to each other like flotsam finally found. For a moment, the household's rough order softened. Aelfwyn, watching from the shadow of a pillar, felt both relief and an old grief. The return of one did not erase the rest who remained. The multiplicity of loss continued to exist even when single losses were righted. But ransoms and returns did not change the shape of the system. They instead made the system legible. Captives could be valued and traded. Skill could render a captive more valuable and therefore more likely to be kept alive. That logic pushed Aelfwyn into the role of an essential functionary. Gudrun, pragmatic and shrewd, used her skills to keep the household profitable. "You keep them useful," she said once, with a hand like a gavel. "That keeps us fed and safe." Aelfwyn heard the message behind the message. Her knowledge produced survival for some and perpetuated the captivity of others. In the quieter hours, she redoubled her secret acts. She taught more than stitch. She folded crosses into hems that were too small to be seen by casual eyes. She taught Edberg a pattern in which threads could be knotted to hide symbols without disrupting the cloth's outward appearance. She insisted that the girls learn a short line of Latin that they could whisper beneath their breath while they worked, a line that pressed their names against their tongues. These were clandestine sacraments, a private liturgy sustained in the seams of garments. They were small resistances that offered meaning without safety.
But such resistance carried danger. One morning, a small boy, one of the household's children, found a scrap of vellum where Aelfwyn had hidden a prayer and carried it to his mother. The mistress discovered it and, in a fit of anger, declared that such talismans were superstition and a threat to order. She seized the scrap and held it up for the hall to see. For a woman who had carried vows and a cross in her pocket, the public exposure of a hidden prayer was frightening. Gudrun's face was unreadable, and the chieftain's mouth set like an iron hinge. "He hides strange things in the cloth," Gudrun said, though the truth was that Aelfwyn had hidden the words herself. The mistress's voice carried the implication. Superstition would not be tolerated. Such items could be cause for punishment. For a heartbeat, Aelfwyn feared the cross in her pocket would be found. When no one searched beyond the scrap, she exhaled like a person saved from drowning. The episode, however, served as a warning. Secrecy was delicate, and exposure could unravel the fragile gains they had won. Then came the day that marked the pivot the chronicles whisper of in halting tones. A party of men arrived from a further north lord who had little patience for households that did not produce. They inspected the island and demanded a demonstration of the household's productivity.
The chieftain, anxious to please his superiors and to secure alliances, ordered a public display. The captives would show the work that made them useful. The spectacle would be a signal of obedience and order, and perhaps a price would be paid for the best pieces. Aelfwyn knew what such a public display required. It needed faces that could be made acceptable in the eyes of outsiders, names that could be pronounced without shame. It needed proof of assimilation. She was told that part of the demonstration would include the captives presenting a small assortment of garments and performing basic household rites. To stand and display made a person legible to power. It made the captive a resource to be appraised. Gudrun called Aelfwyn close and said, "Help them to do it well. Make sure they look as they should. You know how." She did not say the other part. Make sure they appear to belong. Perhaps no explicit order was ever spoken to demand the renunciation of faith. That was seldom necessary. Instead, the ritual of public presentation functioned to suggest new identities. The captives were told to wear garments chosen for them and to answer to names assigned by the household. They were taught to sing brief refrains and to speak simple phrases that signaled their belonging. In some cases elsewhere in the record, chroniclers note that captives were required to forswear old rites. In this setting, the erasure was subtler, performed through altered day-to-day routines and the public performance of new habits. The morning of the demonstration, the hall smelled of oil and damp wool. A crowd gathered on the shore. Traders, allies, men with the stoic faces of those who trade in goods and people. Aelfwyn busied herself with hems, adjusting collars, tucking the cross into seams where it would not show. Her hands moved like a machine powered by necessity. Eadberg, timid and pale, stood beside her, eyes rimmed with the rawness of someone about to be seen and judged. They led the captives forward, one by one, and the chieftain's guests appraised the work with the eyes of men who saw value and exchange rather than human stories. Some were bought, some were admired, some were passed by. When they reached Aelfwyn, she felt for an instant the old altar's air. Bells she could not hear, but the feeling was immediate and then gone. The chieftain nodded approvingly. The guests murmured their approval. Aelfwyn felt like a servant who had learned how to hide a relic in the folds of a cloak and smile while being weighed. Afterwards, they drank. The island officers shared news, and the captives were released back to their places. But the demonstration had done its work. It showed that capture could become profitable in ways beyond immediate plunder. It normalized the transformation of persons into produce. The pressure to appear happy, to appear acclimated, intensified. Those who had skill were kept, offered as assets in a new economy.
The rest were more likely to be sold or traded. This moment is the one that historians often point to when they speak about the long-term effects of raids, not merely the loss of life in the initial attack, but the creation of systems in which survival depended on repayment of a cost far more profound than hunger, a cost that demanded the slow remaking of identity. The sources are careful here. Some accounts indicate that captives could be fully assimilated. Others suggest that many retained forms of private remembrance. It is, in the archives, a mixed and incomplete picture. A brief, later monastic note preserves a memory of the event. They were shown forth like cloths. Men chose and paid. Many remain where we cannot follow them with our eyes. The tone is flat with sorrow, as if an inventory can scarcely hold the human shame. Aelfwyn's inward life continued its secret resistances. She found ways to stitch prayers into the very fabric of work. She showed the girls a trick of knotting that hid a cross at the base of a seam, a tiny symbol that to most eyes looked only like a flaw of thread.
She urged them to remember their old names in whispers while they worked, to recite a line of a psalm under their breath, as if it were only a counting of stitches. The acts were small but tenacious, a private liturgy preserved in the rhythm of labor. Yet the moral cost remained. The more she taught, the more she perpetuated the household's dependence on captive labor. Her students learned and then taught others. The knowledge that had once been consecrated to altar and prayer became, by the arithmetic of survival, part of a domestic economy. Her hands were stained with that exchange. Sometimes she caught Eadberg's eye and saw gratitude. Sometimes she saw in the pupils a look like hunger and knew their skills would be used to make others complicit. Years passed with the slow compressing of lives. Names changed. New children, born of unions between captors and local women, grew and learned both tongues. The island's layers of practice overlapped. Christian motifs survived in varied crosses and odd hymn fragments left to memory. Norse names proliferated in the community's roles. The palimpsest of culture was messy and human, and in many cases irreversibly altered. Decades later, how many is indefinito, the record inexact, Aelfwyn's story appears as scattered notes. Some sources suggest she was spoken of in a later household list under a new name. Others leave her unrecorded, known only in the whispered lineage of seamstresses who kept a secret knot. One late medieval scribe, writing perhaps from hearsay and memory, penned a short line. A sister lived here who taught and hid her prayers in cloth. Men say she lived long among them. The line mixes admiration and pity. It signals continuity and the impossibility of recovering whole lives from the fragments left behind. And that is where archaeology steps in, offering objects where text is thin.
In recent centuries, careful excavations on the island and its shores have revealed graves, fragments of textile, and small metalwork. A bent copper alloy cross found in a shallow grave near a habitation layer dated to the period of early Norse contact bore signs of wear that suggested it had been hidden and carried close to the body. In a midden deposit, tiny fragments of worked linen with decorative motifs consistent with ecclesiastical use were recovered. Several beads, pierced in a manner for pendants, were found in contexts that indicate personal adornment rather than trade. A modern archaeologist who has worked on these finds explains with the caution of a profession that knows the danger of certainty. Material evidence cannot tell us words. It cannot narrate the longings of a life. What it can do is indicate continuities of practice, objects that appear to be personal devotional items in contexts that also show Norse activity suggest that private faith persisted in the face of forced change. But these are hints, not whole stories. We must be careful not to overread single items. The archaeology provides a texture to the written sources and offers space for the lives that paperwork leaves out. Her tone is precise, academically modest. She frames interpretation with the care the subject demands. One finds, in the layers of the earth, traces of the life Aelfwyn might have left behind. A hairpin worked into a grave, a bead threaded into the soil near a child's jaw, a scrap of linen whose weave pattern matches techniques described in monastic texts. Each artifact is small, and each could be read multiple ways, but together they form an argument for persistence, that private acts of devotion and memory continued even as public forms were altered. A deeper piece of evidence lies in the social patterns that follow. Place names, family lineages, and the distribution of material culture show a mingling of practices. In some island households, liturgical objects are found alongside Norse-style harness fittings. In other graves, the orientation of the body suggests Christian burial practices preserved amidst other customs. These palimpsests resist a neat narrative of total erasure. They indicate that while violence and coercion could and did reshape communities, they did not always succeed in wiping out inner lives or cultural memory. We return to the human count. The long-term effect was a new social order in which some people lived with stitched-together identities, parts of former selves preserved in secret, parts lost to the logic of survival. For many captives, survival required crafting a new life that incorporated tragedy and adaptation. Some became effective members of households and even gained particular status through their work. Others were never able to recover the forms of their prior lives. The moral ambiguity is not a failing of the historian, but a historical fact. Survival,
often means compromise. How, then, do we remember?
To remember is not merely to tally the dead or to list the stolen chattels. It is to understand the mechanisms by which lives were made to mean something else, to name the slow processes of assimilation, the rituals of renaming, the pressure to perform belonging. Memory must hold both the blaze and the stitch, the sudden violence of the raid and the prolonged, quieter reassembling of persons into a new world. A final archival insertion, blunt in its restraint, comes from a later monastic chronicle. They were taken, some returned, others stayed. Their songs are known to no books we have, but perhaps to graves. The sentence is a lament that acknowledges the limits of record and the need for other forms of testimony. The things that archaeologists and historians bring to light are not merely evidential, they are ethical. They tell us that when a culture conquers or absorbs another, the tools of domination are not only weaponry and fire. They are clothes that must be worn, names that must be adopted, livelihoods that must be remade. They are the quiet, grinding procedures that convert persons into roles. These procedures can be as lethal to a sense of self as a blade. As for Aelfwyn, we cannot tell with certainty how her final years passed. Some fragments suggest she lived long enough to teach a generation of women whose hands carried her stitches. Other hints suggest she may have been ransomed and returned to a place where home had changed too much to be recognized. What we can say with confidence is this: the acts she performed, teaching, hiding a cross, whispering a line of prayer, were forms of resistance and of survival, each with moral complexity. They represent the kinds of choices that many captives faced: to keep faith and perhaps die, to adapt and survive, or to negotiate a life in which pieces of former identity were stitched into new cloth. In the end, what the Vikings did at Lindisfarne in that first terrible night extended far beyond the flames. The immediate loss of life and the physical destruction were acute and unmistakable. The longer harm was the conversion of sacred practices into household commodity, the renaming of people, the turning of vows into silence. That is the meaning of worse than death. Not simply that bodies were taken, but that the things that made life holy, names, vows, liturgies, community, were made into things that could be traded, hidden, repurposed. The obligation of memory is to keep both tragedies visible, the blaze and the stitch. To remember the women who were taken is to render visible the processes that continued in the long aftermath, to see how power worked not only through the sword, but through daily tasks, through enforced habits, through the repurposing of skill. It is to understand that memory itself is a form of resistance, that the recovery of small objects, the conservation of tiny crosses, the careful reading of a single chronicle fragment, all fight the erasure intended by violence. If archaeology and archives give us objects and numbers and names, or the absence of names, they also give us an ethical demand. They ask us to make space in our histories for the quiet forms of courage, the seam secretly knotted to hold a cross, the whispered prayer under a child's breath, the steady hand that stitched a garment so another might live. Those acts were, in their way, stubborn affirmations of a life that refused absolute erasure. We end as the story of Aelfwyn ends in history, partly in silence, partly in evidence. The island still keeps its stones and the ghosts of bells. Excavations continue. New layers are peeled back and examined. The small copper alloy cross is conserved in a museum drawer, its patina cleaned and catalogued, its provenance explained with careful qualifications, found in contexts suggesting personal use, interpretation tentative. The bead fragments and textile scraps hang in a climate-controlled cabinet where their presence testifies to lives lived at the edges of records. Remembering them is not an act of sentimentality, it is a responsibility. To share their story, to say aloud that the destruction extended into the quiet work of making people into useful things, is to bear witness to mechanisms of power that persist in different forms across history. It is to honor the complexity of survivors who lived under impossible choices and to resist the simplification that reduces history to triumph or villainy. If this account has touched you, share it with someone who will listen. Let these fragments of a life, crosses bent and hidden, stitches taut and half-light,
names muffled by new tongues, be held in memory so that the method of erasure is not repeated in other guises. In the description below, you will find suggested sources and readings for those who wish to learn more. Archaeology and careful scholarship offer the best ways we have of approaching such painful histories. We will remember the women of Lindisfarne, not only for the ways they suffered, but for the ways they kept their interior lives intact, in hidden seams, in whispered prayers, in the persistence of small devotional objects. That endurance, fragile and tenacious, is the story that remains when the fires have long since cooled.